Well, first of all, it's not easy to be the last speaker after so many distinguished speakers have done so much good analysis. I think what I'm going to try to do is maybe touch on some new points, but also summarize much of what is said today. But first of all, also just recognizing the very high-level representation of my colleagues, and certainly I'd be remiss not to acknowledge, with President Mouad here, with President Pastrana here, with Vice President Santos here, with Ambassador Baki here, with Secretary General Almagro here. Just a real honor and very difficult to present new ideas with such a distinguished group, but I'm going to try. I also, in the interest of keeping within my 5 minutes, have used prepared remarks, so forgive me if it's a little bit less dynamic, but I want to try to keep as much as possible within time. So first, let me just start out by saying that organized crime in the region, including the global networks to which they're connected, as we've talked about, is for me the single biggest threat beyond the People's Republic of China to U.S. security and prosperity. Looking at the U.S., I'd like to start by saying those impacts are far more significant and complex than is commonly understood. As we've seen with Mexico's Sinaloa cartel, the principal source of fentanyl, and 70,000 of the more than 110,000 drug overdose deaths here per year, organized crime brings drugs that kill more Americans than virtually any other non-medical cause. As we've also seen with Tren de Aragua, organized crime also preys on desperate migrants, bringing crime and violence to U.S. cities, among others. Beyond these direct effects, it foments corruption and violence, as we've talked about, in the societies where it operates. This, of course, as we've seen, leads to economic malaise, institutional failure, and political discontent. These, in turn, in this cycle, drive migration, impacting not only the U.S., but virtually every other country in our region. More indirectly, but importantly, citizen discontent with the performance of those distorted economies and damaged democratic institutions opens the door for the capture of power by anti-U.S. populists, as we've seen with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, with Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, with Rafael Correa in Ecuador, with Evo Morales in Bolivia, among others. Citizen disillusionment with corrupted democracies weakens also their resistance as those authoritarians, bit by bit, consolidate power by bending or ignoring the rules. As they consolidate power, anti-U.S. authoritarians also cut cooperation with the U.S. and others in law enforcement, extradition, intelligence, and other areas. That, even more, gives organized crime a safe haven in their countries, often benefiting it from themselves, those leaders, as we've seen with persons like Maduro. From these authoritarian sanctuaries, organized crime is then able to consolidate and penetrate neighbors, such as Colombia, including through both illicit commerce as well as through those destabilizing refugee flows. Moreover, the criminally empowered anti-U.S. authoritarians also embrace, as we've seen, problematic relationships with anti-U.S. adversaries, such as the PRC, such as Russia, such as Iran. And those actors, in turn, provide the authoritarians with the resources, with the military and the digital tools, and also the political cover to continue their reign. Continuing, for me, it's also important to understand the context and the extent and the complexity of these evolving dynamics of organized crime. First, just talking a little bit about what we've already discussed, the conditions we find ourselves in. Latin America and the Caribbean are currently awash in cocaine. The land under cocoa cultivation in Colombia has increased from 40,000 hectares to over 250,000 today. Last year, of course, in Colombia, cocaine production increased by 53% alone. Neighboring Venezuela has devolved, importantly, from a transit country largely for Colombian cocaine to also a producer with laboratories. In Peru, cocoa production has spread from the Vraim, the Mantaro, Apurumac, and Eni River valleys into the jungle lowlands bordering Colombia, Brazil, and Bolivia. In addition to Colombian groups and to Mexico's Sinaloa and Jalisco Nueva Generación cartels, as we've talked about, Brazil's First Capital Command, PCC, and the Red Command, Comando Vermelho, they have increasingly become important in South American routes. Also, as noted previously, with Europe becoming a lucrative market for cocaine, Italy's 'Ndrangheta, Albanian mafias, and various other European groups are also increasingly present. The use, of course, of Ecuador to export Colombian cocaine, as we've seen, has dramatically increased violence and outmigration from that country. Drug flows also through the Caribbean, and the availability of small arms have transformed once benign youth gangs there and have produced also enormous violence in the small island states such as Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica. Also, technologies available to often cash-flush groups further contribute to the effectiveness and damage they do. Important to mention narco-submarines, low-profile boats, towed buoys, which all traverse Pacific routes from Colombia and Ecuador to Guatemala and Mexico, creating detection and intercepting challenges. Narco-subs, however, are also increasingly used in Atlantic transit routes across the Caribbean all the way to Europe. Drones are another expanding problem. They're used for surveillance, for transporting contraband, including into prisons, and also for attacks. The Colombian military has suffered, just in the past year, hundreds of incidents in places like Catatumbo. In Ecuador last year, a large drone attack attempted to blow a hole in the maximum security prison at La Roca. A Mexican general was almost killed earlier this year in a drone attack against his convoy. With gold now over $4,000 an ounce, it was $3,000 last week when I wrote this, but now over $4,000 an ounce. In some countries, illegal mining has now surpassed drugs as an illegal revenue source and is often used to launder money. The Orinoco Basin of Venezuela, the interior of Colombia, Suriname, Guyana, Peru, and Bolivia are particularly problematic areas. With respect to immigration, the massive displacement of Venezuela, more than 8 million as we've seen, but also Ecuadorians, Haitians, Cubans, and others have all facilitated the spread of violent criminal groups such as, but not only, Tren de Aragua. It's also important to note that splinter groups now within Tren de Aragua are now emerging, and also local groups in the region are copying the violent techniques of Tren de Aragua and these others, farther expanding the violence. And approaching the end, the expanding presence of PRC-based companies, banks, and individuals in the region has also complicated the fight against organized criminality. The PRC is, and it's important to recognize, the leading source of precursor chemicals for fentanyl and other synthetic drugs. And also, PRC-based companies and banks are increasingly used for money laundering, creating problems for financial intelligence units and also analytical opportunities for that other FIU. With respect to solutions at home, for me, a focus on illicit money flows is key, as well as extradition and expanded cooperation, as my colleagues have noted. This includes intelligence sharing, more joint operations, and helping our partners to combat corruption and strengthen the technical capabilities of their police and judicial institutions. For me, and to say the obvious, it is also vital not to permit regimes such as those of Venezuela to continue to serve as sanctuaries for criminal groups. If we end with just going after drug boats and not the root causes of the problem, we are stopping far short of what we need to do. Finally, I do welcome the possibility that the increased attention from the current U.S. administration to the role of this region for U.S. security can also translate into more effective cooperation to combat this pernicious and destabilizing challenge of organized crime. Thank you very much.